On a summer night in 1996, a Boeing 747 lifted off from JFK with 230 people on board, climbed into the dark over the Atlantic, and then, in the space of seconds, turned into a national mystery that has never stopped arguing with itself. What happened next was witnessed by hundreds of people, investigated by multiple federal agencies, and dissected for years by families, journalists, engineers, and skeptics. And yet, the central question still cuts in two directions at once. Was this a fuel tank explosion inside the aircraft? Or was something far more sinister in the sky? I'm not gonna tell you to ignore the conspiracy theories, because that would be dishonest. But I'm also not going to tell you to accept them as fact, because that would be irresponsible. What I am going to do is strip this case down to what was seen, what was recovered, what was tested, and what still doesn't sit comfortably with a lot of people. Because when you do that, you find something unusual. The official story has a science backbone, but the public's suspicion has a human backbone. And in a case like this, both matter. The most important thing to understand is that this story doesn't begin with an explosion. It begins with a sequence of small, ordinary moments that in hindsight feel ominous because they led to something catastrophic. A delay at the gate, engines coming alive, a routine takeoff, a cockpit remark about an odd fuel flow indication, a climb into the night, a final radio call, and then a bright event in the sky that split the world into before and after. That sequence is where the case lives, because everything that followed was an attempt to explain what that moment really was. TWA Flight 800 departed JFK July 17, 1996, after a delay that on its face looked procedural and minor. The aircraft pushed back from Gate 27 at about 8:02 p.m. Eastern Time, reportedly delayed because of a baggage mismatch. By 8:04, the engines were being brought online, with the final engine starting during taxi. By 8:19, the plane had lifted off from runway 22R and began its climb into the evening sky. This matters because disasters are often remembered as a single moment, but investigators have to work with sequences. They have to ask what was normal, what was unusual, and which detail actually mattered. At exactly 8:29:45 p.m., about 2.5 minutes before the explosion, the captain made a comment about a strange fuel flow indicator on number 4. That remark would later become a point of debate, because in a case this contested, even a casual cockpit observation can be treated like a clue, a distraction, or a coincidence depending on what story you believe. At 8:30 p.m., Boston Center instructed the crew to climb to 15,000 feet, and the pilots acknowledged. Then at 8:31:12, the aircraft's last radar transponder return was recorded at about 13,760 feet. Less than a minute later, East Wind Airlines Flight 507 reported seeing an explosion around 16,000 feet, and the aircraft went down into the water. By then, the sky over Long Island had already become the center of one of the most disputed aviation accidents in modern history. What makes this case endure is not just that the aircraft was lost, it's that the first public explanations fractured almost immediately. There was an official investigation which eventually concluded that the center wing fuel tank exploded after an ignition of flammable fuel-air mixture. And then there was the witness-driven public narrative, which included reports of a streak of light, an object rising toward the plane, and widespread suspicion that something external had struck the aircraft. Those two accounts did not merely differ, they competed. The competition began almost as soon as the wreckage hit the water. The plane crash killed all 230 people on board, making it one of the deadliest aviation disasters in U.S. history. Recovery efforts were enormous. Roughly 95% of the wreckage was eventually recovered in what became one of the largest salvage operations ever conducted with divers. The cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder were recovered by Navy divers a week later. From the beginning, this was not a case with a small amount of evidence. It was a case with an overwhelming amount of evidence and still no agreement on what it meant. The families felt that tension immediately. Some were frustrated by delays and confusion. Some were alarmed at the rapid drift toward the fuel tank explanation. Others were convinced from the start that something criminal had happened in the air. That atmosphere helped turn that disaster into more than an accident investigation. It became a battle over trust. The official account, as the NTSB ultimately presented it, rests on reconstruction, testing, and elimination. Investigators spent years on the case, and at the time it was considered the most extensive and costly air disaster investigation in American history. The final report came out in August of 2000 after a process involving the NTSB, the FAA, NASA, the FBI, Boeing, TWA, and other agencies. That kind of cooperation sounds reassuring on paper, but in a case like this, it also reflects how many different institutions had a stake in the outcome. The NTSB's conclusion was that the center wing fuel tank exploded because a flammable fuel-air mixture inside it was ignited. They could not determine the exact ignition source with certainty, but they identified the most likely cause as a short circuit outside the fuel tank that allowed excessive voltage to enter through wiring associated with the fuel quantity indication system. In plain language, they believed electrical energy found a way into a place where it should never have gone, and that energy helped trigger a catastrophic explosion. To support that conclusion, investigators reconstructed the aircraft and searched the wreckage for signs of external attack. They found no evidence of structural failure, no metal fatigue, no corrosion problem that would explain the breakup, and no physical signature of a bomb or missile impact. They did not find the kind of pitting, cratering, gas washing, or pedaling that would typically suggest a high-energy explosive device. They also found no radar track that matched a missile approaching the aircraft. In the NTSB's view, the wreckage sequence pointed first to an overpressure event in the central wing tank, and the rest of the breakup followed from there. That is the heart of the official narrative, and it's not a trivial one. It is built on physical evidence, reconstruction, and testable engineering logic. It also led to safety recommendations and regulatory changes, which matter because investigations of this kind are supposed to do more than just assign blame. They're supposed to prevent another disaster. But the reason this case refuses to die is that the official narrative never fully eliminated the emotional force of what witnesses said they saw. The FBI interviewed 736 witnesses. The account that emerged from that phase of investigation was not a neat consensus, but it did include a striking number of people who describe a streak of flight. 258 witnesses reported some version of a streak, and 38 described something that seemed to rise vertically or nearly vertically toward the aircraft. That is not a trivial number of people making a casual observation. It's a large cluster of human testimony, and it is exactly the sort of thing that keeps conspiracy theories alive long after the official reports are published. The public account formed around those observations. If you believe the witnesses were accurately describing an object moving upward toward the plane, then a missile theory starts to sound plausible. The sequence appears to fit. A moving light, then an explosion, then the aircraft breaking apart. Add in the FBI's initial criminal investigation, the secrecy around witness summaries, and the discovery of trace explosive compounds on some wreckage samples, and you get a story that feels to many people unfinished at best and covered up at worst. This is where the conspiracy theory becomes compelling. Not because it proves itself, but because it answers the emotional logic of the event better than the official report does. People saw something. People heard an explosion. People were told for years that the government had the pieces. But the public often experienced the investigation as incomplete, contradictory, and guarded. And in a case that involved 230 deaths, guarded feels a lot like hiding. The missile theory argues that TWA 800 was shot down by a US Navy surface-to-air missile or possibly struck by an ordnance from a nearby military exercise. Supporters point to the witness streaks, timing of the light before the fireball, the FBI early criminal posture, and the fact that some of the investigators initially withheld witness information from the NTSB for years. They also point to the detection of trace RDX nitroglycerin and P10 on a small number of samples, arguing that explosive residue cannot simply be waved away. But here is where the theory begins to strain against the evidence. Trace residue is not the same thing as proof of a bomb or a missile. Those compounds can be through contamination, handling, or other sources that have to be evaluated carefully. And the wreckage itself did not show the damage pattern expected from a missile or a bomb. There was no corroborated missile track on radar. There were no fragments identified as ordnance. There were no victim injuries that could fit a high-energy external blast. The physical case, in other words, did not match the dramatic public image. That does not make the witnesses liars, and witnesses, especially in a fast-moving nighttime catastrophic event, can be honest and mistaken at the same time. They can accurately report on what they think they saw and still misinterpret what the event actually was. That distinction is crucial because this is not a case where one side is made of monsters and the other side is made of saints. It's a case where perception, timing, darkness, shock, and incomplete information collided with institutional authority. The NTSB's own wording is important here because it leaves room for uncertainty. The agency did not claim with absolute certainty that it had identified the ignition source. It said that the source could not be determined definitively, but that the most likely explanation was electrical. That kind of language is often seized on by skeptics, and understandably so. If investigators cannot name the spark, then people start asking why they should trust the fire. And that's where both stories can exist at once. The official narrative may be stronger on physical reconstruction, engineering, and casual logic. The conspiracy narrative may be stronger on public trust, eyewitness intensity, in the sense that something was never fully confronted. One is not simply the opposite of the other. They overlap in the parts that are hardest to explain. If you take the conspiracy side seriously, you have to admit that the witnesses really did see something unusual, and that the early investigative process fed the suspicion by treating the event like a possible crime before the public had a full explanation. If you take the official side seriously, you have to admit that the wreckage, the testing, and the lack of corroborating missile evidence strongly resist the idea of a shootdown. The challenge is neither side fully dissolves the other. The public suspicion also fits a broader pattern. When a disaster is large, sudden, and poorly understood in its first hours, the first story that reaches people is often the one they remember most deeply. In this case, the first story was not certainty. It was confusion. It was grieving families, conflicting reports, and a sense that the sky had done something impossible. Once that memory takes hold, even the strongest technical explanation has to fight its way through emotion, distrust, and years of cultural reinforcement. So where does that leave us? It leaves us in the uncomfortable but honest place where many major investigations end, with a conclusion that is stronger in one sense and weaker in the other. The NTSB's explanation is the more defensible physical account. It is based on wreckage, testing, reconstruction, and the absence of evidence for a missile or bomb. That matters, and it matters a lot. But the conspiracy theories did not appear out of nowhere, and they did not survive because people were gullible. They survived because the case produced real uncertainty, real witness accounts, real institutional suspicion, and real gaps in how the story was communicated to the public. That's why I think both narratives can exist, even if they cannot be fully right in the same literal sense. The official story can be about the mechanics of the explosion while still failing to answer why so many people believed they saw an object in the sky. The conspiracy theory can be right about the atmosphere of secrecy, the public distrust, and the emotional plausibility of foul play while still failing to prove an external attack. In a case like this, Truth is not always a single clean line. Sometimes it's a collision between evidence and perception. What happened to TWA Flight 800 is not just a question about one aircraft. It's about a case study in how disasters become narratives, how institutions try to explain the unexplainable, and how the public reacts when the explanation feels smaller than the event itself. A fuel tank explosion may be the best supported physical conclusion, but it doesn't erase the witnesses, the fear, or the suspicion that grew in the aftermath. And that is why this case still haunts people. Because even after all the wreckage was lifted from the sea, the story never settled into one shape. It remained divided between what could be reconstructed and what could only be believed. Until next time, I'm Kyle Fields. Take care.